you have a really good tilt on that glass. It's going to help your nose bypass some of these harsh alcohol vapors, get right to the good stuff you're trying to smell. Keep your mouth open as you breathe in through your nose for the same reason. And just tell me what you smell. There are no wrong answers, but you're not allowed to say bourbon, whiskey, liquor, alcohol, booze, or hooch. I feel like that's cheating just a little bit.
That is very earthy. Yeah.
I think we like it. We like it.
Yeah,
For the 1870, for me personally, there is a very healthy balance of sweet and spice with this one, right? So in terms of sweet, there's always a little bit of like vanilla, caramel, sure, but I would say in terms of sweet, most people tell me fruity notes for this one. Most people tell me banana. After that, I hear green apple. But honestly, you name a fruit, I've heard it in this room before. Cherry, apricot, pears. I've heard mango, pineapple. A lady earlier this week, she said peach iced tea. I thought that was like spot on. There's lots of spice, right? I'm hearing very earthy, right? You got a lot of oak coming in from that barrel, very woodsy kind of finish, like almost like leather, tobacco, clove, cinnamon coming through as well. Feel free to take that first sip if you haven't yet. That first sip is important. This first sip is here to help you to acclimate your palate to this high proof alcohol. If this is your first sip of bourbon today, assuming it is, or if it's not, welcome to Kentucky. You're doing it right. Yeah, you're drinking like a local. I'm proud of you. But if it's not, always know, even like a little baby 90 proof is going to be a shock to your palate. That first sip is always going to burn just a little bit. So what you want to do to help with that, to make that burn go down a lot easier, well, you just got to keep drinking, really. That's the only way. But every sip that you take from here on out will become easier for you to drink. Your palate is trying to ready itself in case you come across a higher proof. So by the time we make it to our 115 proof down here, your palate should be able to handle that higher proof a whole lot easier.
Why is it 1870?
1870 is 90. Or wait, oh, why is it 1870? Good segue, thank you. So all of these are named after dates, you'll notice. This one is our 1870. All of these are like a nod to our history, but the 1870 is kind of like a nod to George's original batching process. So George, when he first started off, he was not distilling, he was what's called rectifying. So he was buying bourbon from other distilleries and just batching those together to create his own product. Very, very normal thing to do back then. So back then he was batching from 3 different distilleries, Mattingly, Melwood, and Atherton. So, and then eventually, once the Bottled and Bond Act was passed, he purchased the Mattingly distillery, and that's where we distilled up until the start of Prohibition. Now, with the 1870 original batch we put out today, we're just paying homage to that same process, but instead of different distilleries, we're now batching from 3 different warehouses, 3 different aging environments. Everything we're drinking is small batch today, but this one is the smallest batch. We are only pulling 7 barrels from each of those 3 warehouses to make one full batch of 1870. Now, you try to do that in 2023, create the same, flavor and consistency every time using only like 20 barrels or so. Even today, that is no small feat. But for George to be doing that 150 years ago and use his own name, his signature, as the guarantee of consistency, I mean, that's a lot. That's a big old flex. George was a rock star in this industry, so just a nod to him. We're going to move on to one of my favorites, something a little bit more decadent. This next one here is our 1897 Bottled and Bond. We're jumping from 90 to 100 proof with this one here. Always try to nose before you taste.
So it's all 1870, 90 proof?
Old Forester was first presented at 90 proof, so kind of like another nod to like what George was doing when he first started.
That's the same proof level, or?
I mean, all of these are always going to be these proofs. Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe I don't understand. Okay, gotcha. Always 90, yeah. And then Bottled and Bond, always 100. Our 1910 will always be 93 proof. Yeah, you got it. Now, on the nose with this one, now we're getting some of those classic bourbon flavor profiles, right? So lots of vanilla, lots of caramel. I've always called this one like my Christmas bourbon. You kind of get this almost eggnog thing coming through. Very warm baking spices, nutmeg, allspice, and clove again. Feel free to taste. This one's my favorite one to drink neat. It's all about that finish. Really bright sweetness hits your palate, but this one's going to morph into a spice very quickly. A lot of people say this one kind of drinks like a rye almost. Really big, like heat right on the center of your palate. It'll drift towards the back, bubble up in your throat a bit. For some people, it does the opposite. Comes all the way back up to the front. Really sits and tingles at the front of your palate. What do you think?
I get a lot of blueberry.
Blueberry.
It's
Oh, I love.
delicious, like dark fruit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like big apricot, like sour cherry. Oh yeah. Remember, our yeast strain, very fruity. Just about every single Old Forester expression has some sort of like fruity element to it, I would say. Now, we all know what Bottled and Bond means, the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, all that good stuff. The Bourbon and Bond Act was the very first Consumer Protections Act ever passed for anything ever in the United States. Before Americans even cared about their food, they cared a whole lot more about getting their whiskey right first. The FDA was not even created for another decade after the Bourbon and Bond Act was passed. If you want to be bottled and bond, it must be 100 proof, 4 years old, at least 4 years old, made during one distilling season at one single distillery each and every time. You knew as a consumer, if you bought something bonded, it was going to be safe to drink every single time. Now, always remember, George Garvin Brown was already doing this for 27 years before this was made into law. Everybody admired what George was doing. A lot of distillers admired what he was doing, but the problem was it was very expensive to do what George was doing. At the time, this was not a cost-effective way to sell bourbon, to bottle it individually. But with the passing of the Bottled and Bond Act, that gave a lot of those smaller distillers like tax breaks and tax incentives so they could start to kind of follow suit, follow in George's footsteps. You can argue that George is a bit of a pioneer for a lot of the safeguards that we still see in place today. All right, now, these chocolates here in front of you, these are called Majescas. This is marshmallow dipped in caramel, dipped in chocolate, with smoked bourbon sea salt sprinkled on top. You're eating a little piece of Louisville history. We've been making Majescas in Louisville for over 100 years. Feel free to pair it with this next bourbon we're going to try. This pairs excellent with our 1910. So feel free to start nosing and tasting that one as soon as you feel ready. Has anyone ever tried the 1910 before? There's always a few fans. Okay, cool. This one's really good. Have you had it before?
No.
Oh, you'll love it. You'll love it.
Which it's so much great. 1920s?
1910. This one here. 1910. Old fine whiskey. We're going back down in proof to 93 with this one here. Now, very unusual, right? A little different. We're still sweet. We're getting sweeter and sweeter. Very sweet, fruity, but also smoky, right? Think like maple syrup, brown sugar, but more of that sour cherry, more of like a raisin fruitiness kind of peeking through. As you taste this one, really try to move that 1910 around on your palate a little bit. Really pay attention to the texture. This one is very creamy. It's very buttery. It's got a very like slippery kind of texture to it compared to the first two bourbons that we tried. Probably the smoothest finish in this whole line. You like it? Oh yeah. 1910, Old Fine Whiskey. Now, I showed you guys an original bottle of Old Fine Whiskey in that fancy display case out there. I'm hoping you guys are seeing from our history that when you're a brand that's been around as long as we have, you can see we just end up doing a lot of things first. Mostly just out of necessity. We had to do it at the time. But sometimes you did something first because you did it by accident, and that's really the story behind the 1910. Now remember, this building was our main office headquarters for almost 50 years. A lot of firsts happened for us right here in this building. This room is the same room from this photograph here. When you leave, if you look over this glass wall, you can see the same windows that you see in the photograph. Around where you guys are sitting, that's where George Garvin Brown was sitting back in 1904. Do you feel his presence? Do you feel it? I've always wanted to do like a seance, like for what do you call it, like for Halloween. I thought it'd be like a fun tour. They shot me down really fast, but it's okay. We all think that George is still here, that he's haunting us, like at least a little bit. He's a nice ghost, so he's really good. All right, now the 1910. In this building, maybe like 5 or 6 years after this photograph was taken, there was a fire that erupted on our bottling line right here in the building. Bourbon and fire do not mix very well, so we very suddenly had to get all of this bourbon off of the line and out of the building as quickly as possible. What's a fast way to do that in the year 1910? You throw all of that bourbon back inside the nearest empty barrel, you just roll it out the back as quick as you can. We were able to save the building from the fire, but we kind of just forgot about those barrels where we stashed them in a brick house, and we just forgot about them for quite a bit as we were getting our distillery back up and running again. Now, our president at that time was Owsley Brown, George's son. When he came back to these forgotten barrels and he tasted them again, he noticed that the flavor changed for the better by aging it twice in different barrels. Problem was, there wasn't a name for that kind of thing back then, but Owsley had a feeling he was onto something, so he just called it some very fine old whiskey. He signed his name to the bottle just like his dad, and he sold it on the market. You look at that old bottle out there once more before you leave, you can still see Owsley's handwritten signature still visible on that label more than 100 years later, and all in this building. So we want to pay homage to Owsley with our 1910, because he did not know it back then, but he had discovered the first documented case of what we now refer to as a double-barreled or a double-out. So with our 1910, we're going to age our bourbon, regular bourbon way. But when we dump it, we're going to put it back inside a brand new barrel. But The level of char on our second barrel is extremely heavy. Our master distiller is quoted as saying, "We obliterate the barrel for the 1910 to the point where if we charred it any longer, the wood will create ash and it will not be usable for bourbon anymore." We're going way beyond a level 5, way beyond 60 seconds for the 1910. It's going to stay in that really heavily charred barrel for 9 months. Then we're going to dump it, proof it down to 93, put it in a bottle. There you have it, 1910. So aging it this way is going to give your bourbon sweet yet smoky notes on the palate. Really creamy, buttery texture as well. I mean, for a 93 proof, look at that color, right? Look at it compared to the 115 proof right next to it. This should be the darkest bourbon up here, but instead it's the little baby 93 right next to it. It's all about how it's been aged. 2 different times in a barrel with a char that we do, it's going to give you a really deep, rich amber color every single time. All right, we like this one? Favorite so far?
Yes.
All right, we're going to cap it off with our last one here. This is our 1920 Prohibition style. Anyone ever tried this one before? Okay, fair warning if you haven't. 115 proof, minimally filtered. She's coming in hot, okay? So you're gonna feel quite the finish. All over your palate's gonna stick with you for a little bit after you've taken a sip. If you like drinking your bourbon neat, if you prefer a big, bold finish, this one's gonna be right up your alley.
It's not. It's coming in
Yeah,
hot.
it's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I call it a creepy uncle hug, more like. It hangs on a little too long. You can't do much about it, right? Just gotta ride it out.
Grab, hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on, that's like this. Hold on.
What do we think? We like it? This one's solid, really solid.
Did the guy lick the wall? This is
Say what?
favorite? The
That
wall?
guy didn't make it to this point. Let's just put it that way. Yeah, he did not make it to the tasting. Drink responsibly, everyone. Drink responsibly. Now, we feature this bourbon at a 115 proof because we like to call this a barrel strength medicine, so to speak. Now, if you were drinking your bourbon legally during the Prohibition era, you were probably drinking it as medicine. You had a prescription for it. Back then, you were allowed a pint at a time every 10 days. On a prescription, it was really funny. It said the dosage was like 2 to 3 tablespoons a few times a day, and in quotes it would say for whatever ails you. We wrote 6 million prescriptions during the first year of Prohibition. What's interesting is 2 million of those were written in the city of Louisville. What's even more interesting is Louisville had not yet reached a population of 1 million by that time, which means a whole lot of people came from even outside of Kentucky to come to Louisville to get themselves some really tasty medicine. Now, if you've ever heard the term barrel proof or batch proof or cask strength, it all means the same thing. It means that bourbon has touched no water before it went to the bottle. Whatever that proof is, dump it out of the barrel, that's what's going to be in the bottle. Now, in the Prohibition era, right before production halted, distillers watered down their white dog a lot before it went in for aging because you were able to stretch product a lot more that way. So back during that era, your barrel proof coming out of the barrel would have hovered around 110, 112, highest would have been around 115 or so. But because of the Bourbon and Bond Act, we would still proof it down to 100. Most consumers back then wouldn't even buy it unless it was bonded, especially as medicine, just trying to make sure what they were doing was safe. So, barrel strength medicine. This is what we assume our medicine would have tasted like before we proofed it down with any water. Also very minimally filtered as well. Now, remember, Old Forester was one of only 6 distilleries to obtain a license to allow us to sell our bourbon only as medicine during Prohibition. Of Prohibition's 13-year span, of those 6 distilleries, many of them, they changed names, they changed owners, they changed locations entirely. But of those 6, only 1 is still in the city where it started, still owned by the same parent company, still being led by the same exact family that owned the brand. And that's Old Forester, that's Brown-Forman. No other brand can say that. Quite literally, since the year 1870, not 1 year in history has gone by that you could not buy yourself a bottle of Old Forester, even during Prohibition. Again, we talk about a legacy, right? Can't beat it, can't beat it. All right, guys, we got a favorite out of all 4. What do we like? What do we like? 1910? 1910. Love it, love it, love it. That double barrel, it's hard to ignore. All right, guys, all of these bourbons are available for purchase downstairs in the gift shop. George's Bar is open for at least another hour before they do last call. I don't know your all schedule, but you can taste all kinds of premium products in George's Bar downstairs. Birthday Bourbon 117, President's Choice single barrel as well. We're doing a bourbon espresso martini downstairs as well, but we got perfect old fashions, lion's tail, all kinds of different cocktails down there you can try. These lapel pins on the table, that is our gift to you. Make sure to take those home with you. Once again, y'all, my name is Carly. I work real hard to make sure you all leave here OFO experts. Hope you all have fun and learning along the way.